In this session, we'll look at the tumultuous 17th century. Thinkers about philosophy, religion, and science, which in those times were all studied together, began to view things in a new way. Looking beyond the closed world of the medieval church, notions of natural law, consciousness, and human individuality emerged. During this period, a new class, the bourgeoisie, also known as the capitalist class, gained increasing influence in the Netherlands and later England. These were revolutions, both religious and social. In those times, almost all philosophy was seen through the prism of religion. The idea of a sun-centered as opposed to earth-centered universe upset the notion of an eternal power hierarchy in which God ruled at the top, followed by the church and the monarch, with ordinary people at the very bottom. So, over the course of the 17th century, the old model of society and way of thinking was challenged in a fundamental way. This period can be described as the beginning of what some call modernity, or as a precursor to the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. But, as we shall see, there was conflict and considerable suffering, as individuals who thought the unthinkable clashed with ideological power holders. Indeed, merely suggesting that the universe was infinite could lead to harsh persecution and even death. In the previous session, we saw how Scottish, German, and English thinkers rediscovered the real world of nature and society in the late Middle Ages. But now we will focus on how the 17th century became a veritable battlefield of ideas. Indeed, some of the thinkers we are about to meet had to roam far and wide, from Rome to France and England and even to Sweden in search of safety. It's perhaps difficult for us today to grasp how dangerous it could be to challenge established powers in writing, lecturing, and preaching, and even in private conversations. The ruling establishments did eventually absorb the ideas and scientific discoveries of the 17th century, but the daring approach of some key thinkers can still provide inspiration for us today. We'll look at two major philosophers, René Descartes and Benedict Spinoza, who have exercised an important influence on the evolution of modern thought. They can be seen as symbolizing quite opposite outlooks, dualism and monism, and yet both came into conflict with prevailing ideologies. In 1600, only 4 years before Descartes was born, a Dominican friar called Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake by the Roman Inquisition. Today, his statue, on the right in this slide, looms over a marketplace in Rome, a gathering point for free thinkers and political activists. Bruno had sought protection from the Roman Inquisition as he wandered from Italy to Switzerland, France, and England. He gave lectures on cosmology in Oxford in 1583, in which he anticipated the ideas of Galileo. His view that the universe was infinite, composed of a single substance but populated by many worlds, caused him to be excommunicated by both Catholic and Protestant churches. On the eve of his execution in Rome, after a trial lasting an incredible 7 years, he said to the judges with astonishing courage, "Perhaps your fear in passing judgment on me is greater than mine receiving it." Descartes began his education in a Roman Catholic school run by Jesuit priests, but he was soon troubled by uncertainty. The perfect world that religious authorities asserted that God had created was not as described. The Italian astronomer Galileo was seeing things in his telescope which shattered old beliefs. Descartes moved to the Netherlands, which was a haven of tolerance, having thrown off the yoke of Roman Catholic absolutism in a war with Spain lasting 80 years. In the newly independent Netherlands, Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht decreed that every individual should remain free in his religion, and no man should be molested or questioned on the subject of divine worship. So it was in the largely Protestant Netherlands that a scientist philosopher like Descartes, a Catholic, and Benedict Spinoza, who we will meet soon, could live in relative safety to write and discuss their ideas. But in France and Italy, the Inquisition was seeking out heretics. Giordano Bruno was not the last to suffer. Another martyr was Lucilio Vanini, a free-thinking philosopher who sought refuge in England at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. But on his return to France in 1619, the Parliament of Toulouse sentenced him to death by strangulation. He was then burnt at the stake, aged 33. Descartes developed a dualist approach. In his view, human beings were divided into a material physiology and an immaterial soul. He saw mind and body as distinct things, two separate substances. The mind, he thought, was not located in space, whereas the body occupied space. Dualism is the doctrine that, in contrast to monism, regards material and spiritual substances as equal and separate principles. It is often invoked in attempts to reconcile materialism and idealism, and the separation of consciousness or mind from matter. In 1630, Descartes moved to Amsterdam, but even there he suppressed his own writings. In his book, The World, he assumed the same sun-centered model that had already infuriated the Catholic Church. It was the very year that Galileo had to appear before the Inquisition in Italy. In 1637, Descartes did go on to publish his Optics, Meteorology and Geometry, in which he developed his doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. This held that an idea was clear if one could be sure about what that idea was, and distinct if it was different from other ideas. Descartes contributed to the development of modern science with his discovery of analytical geometry. His dualist and mechanistic image of the world became widespread. The English physicist and mathematician Isaac Newton embraced Descartes' ideas about gravity and planetary motion and developed his own law of universal gravity, which revolutionized physics. Descartes felt that one thing was certain: I think, therefore I am. This became one of the most famous statements in philosophy. He meant it as a self-evident truth that could be relied upon. He proposed that truth existed, and that true statements were in principle possible. He sought to establish truth by reasoning, beginning with the simplest proposition and then building on it by degrees. Defining the knowing subject, ourselves, as the source of certainty made him a pioneer who still influences modern philosophy. Tensions mounted between Descartes and the theological establishment in the northern Dutch town where he was staying, and he felt increasingly unsafe. After an offer from Queen Christina of Sweden, he moved to her court, where he died within a year, probably of the cold, just before his 54th birthday. These portraits show Descartes on the left and Christina on the right. Descartes' legacy is summed up well by Kurt Smith, and I quote, "The mind-body problem persists. In distinguishing the domain of the mental from that of the physical, Descartes struck a chord. Many philosophers accept the conceptual distinction, but remain uncertain of the underlying metaphysics, whether mind is identical with brain, or the mental emerges from complex processes in the brain, or constitutes a property that is different from any physical property, even while being instantiated by the brain. In this case, a problem that Descartes made prominent has lived far beyond his proposed solution." That's the end of his quote. Benedict, or Baruch, Spinoza, a Sephardic Jew, lived in Amsterdam. The Netherlands had recently liberated itself from Catholic Spain, as we saw a few moments ago. Born in 1632, he was excommunicated by the Jewish community at the age of 23 for evil opinions and acts and abominable heresies. It was the harshest writ of herem, a form of excommunication, ever pronounced on a member of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. It may seem hard to believe, but in 2013, some 360 years later, the Portuguese Jewish community decided not to revoke the herem of Spinoza. But it was not only his own Jewish community that opposed Spinoza's teachings. He had to publish his first major work anonymously due to fears of a reaction from the ruling Calvinist authorities. The only book he could ever publish, his theological political treatise, was denounced as the most dangerous book ever published. It was said to be forged in hell by the devil himself. So what was so shocking about his ideas? Spinoza regarded both mind and matter as simply aspects or attributes of the eternal, infinite, and unique substance he identified with God himself. Thus, Spinoza solved the conundrum that Descartes posed so sharply. Instead of separating mind from matter, Spinoza saw everything as part of a whole, nature and God as one. This was his monism, that there is only one kind of ultimate substance. Monism is the outlook that underlying all existence is one source. For materialism, that is matter. For idealists, it's the spirit. With Spinoza, the single substance is nature, which he said is the cause of itself. No external power or metaphysics was needed. Thus, he cut Descartes' Gordian knot of philosophy, otherwise known as the relationship between mind and matter, thought and the body, the physical and the psychological. And thereby, he reunited brilliantly human beings with nature and their own thoughts. It may well have been Spinoza's denial that there is an immortal self that persists after death which caused such a ruckus. As Spinoza's scholar Stephen Nadler describes it, the free person understands that there is no afterlife, no post-mortem realm of reward or punishment, no world to come. When a person dies, there is for that person nothing. According to informants working for, wait for it,
the Spanish Inquisition, which you never know when to expect.
Spinoza told some visitors to Amsterdam that one of the reasons for his expulsion from the Jewish community was that he said to some friends that the soul dies with the body. But he also wrote in his Ethics that the human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains that is eternal. It remains an eternal idea in God or nature under the attribute of thought. To use Spinoza's beautiful phrase, the mind does continue under the aspect of eternity. Enlightenment historian Jonathan Israel has compared the denunciation of Spinozism during the philosopher's own lifetime to Western Cold War anti-communism of the 20th century. Spinoza's radicalism, in Israel's view, was simultaneously theological and political. He sees him as one of the most foremost proponents of freedom of thought and expression in his age. This is what Israel writes. By the mid-1670s, Spinoza stood at the head of an underground radical philosophical movement rooted in the Netherlands but decidedly European in scope. His books were illegal, but paradoxically, excepting only Descartes, no other contemporary thinker had enjoyed, over the previous quarter of a century, so wide a European reception, even if in his case the reception was overwhelmingly, though far from exclusively, hostile. In Spinoza's view, humans are parts of processes in nature. Our everyday acts are made necessary by the laws of thought, as bodies in motion are by the laws of physics. But this does not stop us from seeking well-being or flourishing or happiness. His view of a free person is that of an active and self-governing agent. The free person is in control of her life. She will be guided from within by knowledge and reason rather than passion or imagination. Spinoza and Descartes belong to the beginnings of the age of reason, given that they stressed the importance of rational human thought and the possibility of understanding the world. More recently, Spinoza's thought has inspired several revolutionary thinkers. They include the Soviet oppositional Marxist Evald Ilyenkov. In his book Dialectical Logic, Ilyenkov summarized Spinoza's great contribution as follows. It is not a special soul installed by God in the human body as in a temporary residence that thinks, but the body of man itself. Thought is a property, a mode of existence of the body, the same as its extension, that is, as its spatial configuration and position among other bodies. Tony Negri, the Italian political philosopher who founded the autonomous, independent trade union movement in Italy, took inspiration from Spinoza. In the 1970s, Negri was sentenced to 34 years in jail by the Italian state, having been falsely accused of supporting terrorism. Negri wrote a book of Spinoza's studies while in prison. Later, he co-authored the book Empire, published in 2000, where he theorized the concept of multitude from Spinoza. His ideas became associated with the global Occupy movement. Spinoza's thought continues to have a massive influence on contemporary thinkers and activists in the field of ethics and human development, activity theory, and concepts of the thinking body. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next session, where we travel to Germany to discover a new resurgence of Enlightenment ideas and the controversial figure of Hegel.